Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about Thurgood Marshall and his contributions to history. Thurgood Marshall was an American lawyer, civil rights activist, and the first African American to serve as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. He was born on July 2, 1908, in Baltimore, Maryland. Marshall was the grandson of a slave, and his father was a railroad porter. Despite the limited opportunities available to African Americans at the time, Marshall's parents instilled in him a sense of pride in his heritage and a determination to succeed. Marshall attended Howard University, a historically black university in Washington, D.C., where he excelled in his studies and became involved in civil rights activism. After graduating in 1933, he attended law school at Howard, where he was mentored by the renowned civil rights lawyer Charles Hamilton Houston. In 1936, he joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, as a staff lawyer. He quickly rose through the ranks, becoming the head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund in 1940. Marshall became known for his work challenging segregation in schools, which culminated in the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. In Brown v. Board of Education, he argued that segregation in public schools violated the principle of separate but equal that had been established in the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson. He and his team presented evidence that segregation in schools had a detrimental effect on African American children, and that separate was inherently unequal. The Supreme Court agreed, ruling that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Marshall continued to work for the NAACP, arguing several other important cases before the Supreme Court, including Shelley v. Kramer, which struck down racial covenants in housing, and Smith v. Allwright, which abolished the white primary system that prevented African Americans from voting in primary elections. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy appointed Marshall to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, making him the first African American to serve on a federal appeals court. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed him as Solicitor General, the government's top lawyer who argues cases before the Supreme Court. Marshall argued several important cases before the Supreme Court as Solicitor General, including the landmark case United States v. Windsor. In 1967, President Johnson nominated Marshall to the Supreme Court of the United States. He was confirmed by the Senate, becoming the first African American to serve on the nation's highest court. During his time on the Supreme Court, Marshall was a staunch defender of individual rights and civil liberties. He was a strong advocate for affirmative action and voting rights and wrote several important opinions in cases related to these issues. Marshall served on the Supreme Court until 1991, when he retired due to declining health. He died on January 24, 1993, at the age of 84. Throughout his life, Marshall fought tirelessly for justice and equality, and his legacy continues to inspire people today. His work as a civil rights lawyer and Supreme Court justice was shaped by his experiences growing up in a racially segregated society. Marshall witnessed firsthand the injustices that African Americans faced and was determined to use his legal skills to fight against discrimination and inequality. Marshall's commitment to civil rights was reflected in his work as a lawyer for the NAACP. He argued numerous cases before the Supreme Court, often challenging the prevailing legal doctrine of separate but equal that had been established in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. Marshall and his team of lawyers presented evidence to the court that segregation in schools and other public places had a detrimental effect on African Americans, and that separate was inherently unequal. Marshall's legal strategy was not only based on challenging the constitutionality of segregation, but also on demonstrating the impact of segregation on the quality of education and opportunities available to African American children. This approach was effective in convincing the Supreme Court to declare segregation unconstitutional in the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education. Marshall's legal work went beyond challenging segregation in schools. He also fought against housing discrimination and the white primary system that prevented African Americans from voting in primary elections. His legal victories in these cases were significant steps towards dismantling the legal structures that had perpetuated racial inequality and discrimination for decades. Marshall's appointment as the first African American to serve on a federal appeals court and later as Solicitor General and Supreme Court Justice was a testament to his legal brilliance and unwavering commitment to justice. During his time on the Supreme Court, he wrote several important opinions that strengthened civil rights protections and expanded individual liberties. In the case of Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, Marshall wrote a dissenting opinion arguing that affirmative action was necessary to ensure diversity in higher education and to remedy past discrimination. This opinion laid the groundwork for affirmative action policies that have helped to increase diversity in education and the workplace. Marshall's legacy extends far beyond his legal accomplishments. He was a trailblazer who paved the way for other African Americans to enter the legal profession and to serve on the bench. His tireless work to promote civil rights and equal justice inspired generations of activists and advocates, and his commitment to fairness and equality remains a guiding light for those who continue to fight for justice today. In addition to his legal work, Marshall was also a committed activist who worked to address social and economic inequality. He was a vocal critic of police brutality and advocated for criminal justice reform. Marshall recognized that discrimination and inequality were not limited to the legal system, but were deeply ingrained in the fabric of American society. He believed that true equality could only be achieved through a broad-based movement that addressed these underlying issues. Marshall's life and work remind us of the power of the law to effect social change and to promote justice and equality. His unwavering commitment to civil rights and his legal brilliance continue to inspire generations of lawyers and activists who seek to make the world a more just and equitable place. Thurgood Marshall's legacy serves as a testament to the importance of courage, persistence, and a deep commitment to justice in the face of adversity.